Hey everyone! Long time no see. I'm Coral. Welcome back to my channel. It's the end of May and this month has been a lot of ups and downs for me personally. We've had just some shit happen in our, Zach and I, we've had some shit happen in our personal life. It's really sucked and it's like continued to suck. Not like with our marriage or anything, just like, I don't know. I don't want to get into it because it's just gonna make me really sad. But also, I had some of my family visit from out of state this last week, so that's been really great, and it's been fun. So my reading's been kind of weird this month, and I'm actually really surprised that I read as many books as I did. So I'm gonna do my little stat thing that I love. In total, I read 11 books this month. My page count was 3,895, which is about 124 pages a day. I have this page goal for the year that was to read, I think it was 35,000 pages. So, of that goal, I have 15,192 left. And then if I subtract what I read this month, I have 11,333 pages until I reach my goal. Another goal I had was to try to read more books off my TBR, books that I owned previous to 2021. And I read 8 books this month that were books that I owned prior to this year. So I did pretty good with that. I read 2 fantasy books, 2 horror books, 2 Southern Gothic books, 2 post-apocalyptic books, 2 thrillers, and a true crime book. The years these books were published, let's see. The oldest book I read this month was published in 1981. Then we had one published in 1984, a 1991 book, a 1992 book. So I got my vintage books in this month. I read 2 books from 2016, 2 books from 2018, and then I have a book published in 2019, one from 2020, and one from this year, 2021. My average rating was 3.7 throughout these books, which is okay. I think this is a lot like last month where I had a lot of 5-star ratings, but I also had a couple 2-star ratings, so it kind of evened itself out, I suppose. All 11 of these books are considered novels. I read 9 books that were adult and 2 that were young adult, although there was a horror book that I read this month that, I mean, it's classified as an adult book, but I really think the writing was kind of immature and it could have been a young adult book even. So 9 of the books were physical copies that I read and 2 were audiobooks. I had 2 5-star predictions that I got to this month. Those were the Cipher and the Road. I'll get to those and how I felt about them. And then the book for the Buzzwordathon TBR, or readathon, was, the buzzword was home. So I read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager, and I will tell you how I felt about that too. The first book I'm going to tell you about today is The Push by Ashley Audrain. This was a weird book. I really liked this book, but I can definitely see, I didn't really look at the reviews for this when I logged it into Goodreads, but I could see that possibly this could be a book that is a little bit polarizing. It's written in kind of a strange way. It's like, it's all written as like a letter to somebody else, you know what I mean? So it's like written, she's talking about you, instead of, you know, as like a third person point of view. So that honestly was a little bit hard to get used to at first, and there are different timelines in here, which is kind of what made it interesting because it turned this book into like a generational study on trauma almost. So that was kind of interesting. The main character here, her name is Blythe, and she is writing a letter to her ex-husband, Fox, and her part of it tells the tale of their relationship together, their marriage, and them raising their children. And she has a daughter named Violet, who right away Blythe has a really hard time connecting with this baby, and she feels like the baby, well, this spans years and years. So Violet obviously starts out as a baby, but even as she gets older, it seems like she targets Blythe and shows Blythe this side of herself that's hostile and violent, and then she kind of turns that off for her dad Fox. And so it feels like for a lot of the book, both Violet and Fox are gaslighting Blythe about this, about Violet's violent behavior, because Fox doesn't see it and Blythe does, and it seems like Violet's doing that on purpose. It's a book about a really creepy kid, basically. But it also tells the story of Blythe's mother and Blythe's grandmother, and how possibly because of the stuff that's happened in her family's past, like, could Blythe maybe be imagining things because her mother and herself, they just didn't have like great mother figures. So it's really interesting. I ended up really liking this up until the very, very end. You really wonder if what's happening is just Blythe's imagination, you know, if maybe she's exaggerating things that is happening with Violet. Man, it was a good one. I really liked this one. Next, I would like to tell you about Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. Actually, I'm not going to tell you about Muse of Nightmares itself, but I'll tell you about the first book in this duology, which was Strange the Dreamer. And that was a book about this is a fantasy book, YA fantasy. It's about this librarian named Laszlo Strange, and he is an orphan who grew up and he was raised by like monks, and now he's a scholar and a librarian, and he's really interested in this lost civilization called Weep. And no one's heard from Weep in a long time, but then all of a sudden, as we, I'm sure, could predict, some people from Weep show up in the city that Laszlo lives in, and they're like, hey, we need some help. And they put together an expedition to go back to Weep and help them with their problem. Laszlo finds himself in this expedition, and it goes on from there. I just have to say, I think that Laini Taylor's writing is very, very beautiful. She has very beautiful writing, and I don't think I'm a person who gets caught up in that so much. I just like to read, and it doesn't really matter to me if a person's writing is like lyrical. I really liked this. I'm glad to be, not that I'm glad to be done with it, but like it just had a nice ending, and there's closure, and there's only 2 books in the series, and I finished it. I'm done with it, and I'm glad. I liked this. This was good. If you like young adult fantasy, I would definitely recommend that. I also read Rites of Burial. Oh my god, why do I keep saying burial so weird? I like look at the word and say it like it's spelled. Rites of Burial by Tom Jackman and Troy Cole. As I found out, Troy Cole was a detective on this case, an investigator, some kind of shit like that, which might account for the way that this is written, which felt very kind of weird. Okay, so this is a true crime book. It's about a guy named Bob Berdella who, this was rough at times, both because of the content and also because of the way it was written. Bob Berdella kidnapped and tortured men, and there are, as a true crime books sometimes have, especially the older ones, have photos in the middle, so you can put a face to the names that they're talking about. But Bob Berdella also liked to take his own photographs of his victims, and some of those show up in here, and they are haunting. It was hard. And this, I'm saying this as somebody who, I consume a lot of true crime, not necessarily only in book form, but like I look things up on the internet, and I fall asleep watching Forensic Files most nights, and I listen to true crime podcasts, which I guess is not visual, but like I have seen a lot of shit, and these photos are haunting. I can't believe that they put them in a book that they then just released to the public. It's crazy and really sad and probably really terrible for the families of the victims. Hopefully they're just not reading this book. He was a really fucking bad dude. And this starts out, I don't know. I think part of the reason I didn't like this so much is because it's not that I didn't like it. It's just the beginning of this book was really hard to get into because it starts out and Bob Berdella, there's no like investigation into the missing people involved in this case, into his victims. Even though, you know, the family was trying to find them, the police just kind of didn't care because they were, you know, people who were in situations where they were possibly, you know, putting themselves at risk. And then they go missing and the police are like, well, probably ran away. And they didn't. They were kidnapped and they were tortured, some of them for a very long time, and they were murdered. So there is no hunt for him. He's just found out because luckily his last victim escapes and goes to the police, even though that was a really hard thing for him to do because this happened in, I think, the late 80s, very, very early 90s. This book was written in 1991 or 1992. So, you know, there's a lot of taboo and a lot of prejudice against men who are gay. So there's a lot of that in this book. Like the detectives, when they find out that Berdella's gay, they're like, oh, are we gonna get AIDS touching any of his belongings? And it's like, oh my god, you guys suck. So I get that that's kind of its time, but also like I grew up in the 90s and I wasn't afraid of getting AIDS from gay people. It's just I don't know, questionable, I guess. Some of their behavior, some of the things that they say and how they act like it's normal to be afraid of gay people. That's it, I guess. So like the beginning was really hard. A lot of it was just them going through the stuff in his house. He had a lot of weird stuff because he owned like a curiosities shop. So he had a lot of stuff in his house. And then it was like he confessed to it and here's what happened. Like the end was hard because it's just this guy reciting basically all the stuff that he did. And he just did not feel any sort of remorse. He talked about killing people like it was a list of errands that he had performed, you know? So that was tough. Okay, let's see. The next two books here I'm gonna go over just very quickly. This is If There Be Thorns and Seeds of Yesterday. They were published in 1981, 1984. These are V.C. Andrews books. Part of her first series, the Dollenganger series, which starts out with Flowers in the Attic. Why did she choose Dollenganger as it's just such a weird name to say out loud. So yeah, these are a part of the Flowers in the Attic series. They follow Kathe and Chris as adults and I guess like the children of this family now. There's one more in the series because it's usually like there's like 4 books that follow the family that they're talking about, and then like the very last book is usually like an origin story of somebody in said family. These are comfort reads for me. I listened to Seeds of Yesterday on audiobook, which was good. I think it's an older production, but it was good. And it prompted me to read Seeds of Yesterday. Like I said, they're comfort reads. I liked If There Be Thorns. Wait, did I say I listened to Seeds of Yesterday on audio? I listened to If There Be Thorns on audio. I liked If There Be Thorns more than some of my previous times reading it. Maybe that had something to do with or maybe the audiobook had something to do with that. Next up, we have Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This was my buzzword read for this month. And this is a book that heavily borrows from stuff like, well, specifically Amityville Horror, some of the quote-unquote true haunting stories, which I love, even though I don't necessarily think that they're true. It's still really spooky. And this is about a young woman named Maggie, and she spent a brief part of her childhood in this house what is it called? Baneberry Hall. And Baneberry Hall has a really sordid history with the people who have inhabited it. There's lots of deaths and really tragic events and stuff like that. So this is told in like dual perspectives. One is Maggie as an adult, and as an adult she's come back to Baneberry Hall after the death of her father to kind of figure out what really happened. She does not believe the contents of the book that her father wrote after her stay as a child in Baneberry Hall. So the other perspective is like you're reading his book, House of Horrors, I believe it was called. So, you know, you get like the House of Horrors take on what happened in alternating chapters, and then it's like Maggie's going over that part of House of Horrors, but like as an adult in this book. So I liked this. It had a couple good red herrings. You really didn't know what happened. At least I didn't. I didn't predict what happened, I guess. And I liked it. It did borrow very heavily from Amityville, and I know like that's purposeful, but maybe it would have been more exciting if I didn't know the Amityville story so well. I don't know. I liked it. I would recommend it, especially if you like Riley Sager. Like, this is just a really decent Riley Sager book. Next up, I will tell you about Human Flesh by Nick Clausen. This was a really quick read. I read this in one sitting. Some of it is like epistolary, like it's told through emails and text messages, and some of it is like a blog, and then there's like evidence, blah blah blah. So you know that something bad's happened, but you don't necessarily know exactly what happened. And this follows, what was her name? This is following Otha and her little brother Hugh. And this supposedly takes place in Maine. The author is Danish, so this is translated from Danish. I'm not sure if he translated it himself. There is no credit for a translator, so I guess I'm just kind of assuming that he must have done it himself. So, I don't know. I didn't end up really liking this. I thought it felt very immature. And, you know, there's always that thing with translated works where it's like, would this have come off differently if I read it in its native language? Like, if I had read the Danish version of this, would it have felt different to me? I don't know. But I can say for the English version that I didn't really like it. This really tried to be scary, and I didn't think that it was. And like, I don't know. I mean, being scary is so subjective, and obviously a lot of horror books don't scare me, but it was like there was no tension, and I did not fear for the characters because I didn't really like them. I didn't think that there was very much character development. So I should tell you what this is about, huh? This is about Otha and her brother Hugh, and they have to cancel a family trip. So instead, their parents send them to hang out with their grandfather, who they haven't seen for years and years and years. And he lives alone in Maine. And you can tell there's something going on with him, but you don't really know what. And you find out that Grandpa has like a really tragic event in his past, and it's kind of haunted him since then. A lot of this, you just don't really know what happens or what happened in his past until the end. So like, it was like the mystery of what was going on kept me reading, but it felt very unexceptional. And I think what bothered me the most was that the main character, Otha, is supposed to be 19, and she could have passed for a 13-year-old. I think she was very immature. She writes this blog, and it's just, I don't know. I didn't like it. I'm sorry that I didn't like it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't read it. It was a very quick read. I read it in one sitting. Next up, we have House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This is another young adult fantasy book, and it's not even a series. It's just like a story told in one book, and it was a pretty good story. This is a take on the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale, where the princesses get up and dance through the night at like a secret location, and their father is so confused as to why their dancing slippers are so worn out. They should be brand new, and yet they have holes in the bottoms. So this is a take on that. This follows a young woman named Annalie, and she is part of a family that used to have 12 daughters, and some of them have died in very tragic circumstances, mysterious circumstances. And the most recent sister to die, Annalie suspects that it was not an accident but a murder. So there's kind of a murder mystery in this. There's the fantasy aspect, you know, they do eventually go out and dance somewhere unknown. I really liked the world building in this. The family lives on like an island, and so a lot of it is based around like ocean stuff. There's like a religion that was really interesting, and I liked that part of it, but this was extremely slow to get through, and it takes a long time to figure out like what the real, or I guess to get to what the real plot is. So it was hard to stick with at some point, because it was like, what is the point of this book exactly? But once it did get to like the real, I think once we dug deep enough to get to what the real plot was going to be about, what the real conflict was, then it became very interesting. And there were some scenes in this book that were very creepy, very great imagery, bordering on, you know, imagery that you would see in a horror book. I think it was well written, the writing was good, and I really liked the ending. But like I said, it did feel like a slog through the beginning parts of the story. But yeah, I did end up liking it. It's got a really beautiful cover, and Erin A. Craig, I believe, released a book this year, or one that hasn't come out yet, but is coming out this year, that I'd really like to try out too. So this was a great, really great dark fantasy. Okay, next on my list is World War Z by Max Brooks. This was a reread for me, and this I decided to rent on audio from my library because I've heard so many good things about the audio version of this, and it has a full cast. It has got a crazy cast. Man, has people such as Mark Hamill, who of course played Luke Skywalker, Cal Penn, Simon Pegg, Martin Scorsese, Henry Rollins, Rob Reiner. I don't know, there's just a lot of good voices in this. And I thought it was neat because this, if you don't know, this is like after a zombie apocalypse, and like, well, actually, it really tells stories from before, at the very beginning of, during, and after the zombie apocalypse, and what people in different parts of the world did to survive. So it's really interesting because it takes place in so many different places. There's stories from so many different parts of the world, and you know, they got cast members to reflect that. So it was a really great audiobook, and still a 5-star read. I loved it the first time I read it, and I loved it reading it, listening to it the second time too. A really great, I don't know, just such a different way to look at the zombie apocalypse, I guess. It was so much fun. Then I guess coincidentally, I'm down to my 2 5-star predictions. So this first one is actually from last month. Oh, my bookmark's still in here. This is The Cipher by Kathe Koja, and this is a vintage book from 1991. This is featured in Paperbacks from Hell, but I have not been able to get my hands on the copy that is featured in Paperbacks from Hell. It's expensive. It's out of print. This is actually from Meerkat Press though. They did a reprint of it, which is great because now lowly members of society like I can get my grubby hands on it and read it. So I have a lot of conflicting opinions on the Cipher. I think I'm gonna do a whole video on this at some point. I did start to do a Paperbacks from Hell series where I reviewed in a singular fashion paperbacks from Hell books, and there's a couple that I've read and I haven't done that with. I think I'm gonna do it with this one too. So if you'd like to hear my thoughts on that, you'll have to wait a little bit. This video is pretty long anyway, so I don't know, maybe you appreciate that I'm not reviewing that right now. Okay, so last but not least, in the least, this is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is my first time reading any of Cormac McCarthy's books. This is a post-apocalyptic book, and this was really an interesting experience. His writing is very simplistic in this. Reading it didn't make your brain work very hard, but it was very emotional still. This follows a man, we never get any names even. There's a man and a boy, his son, and they are traveling the road after many years after a post-apocalyptic event. So they are very worried about scavengers and people who are bad guys, and they're good guys. So it's hard for them with, you know, some of the situations that they come up against. And I mean, that's just it. It's them traveling, and it's so good. And it's so sad. And I loved these characters that I don't even know by name. It was a really great book. It was a good experience, and it was a fairly quick read. Like I said, it's very simplistic. Your brain doesn't have to work a lot. And somehow still you become emotionally attached to these people. So really loved this book. 5 stars for that 5-star prediction. It was great. So those are the books that I ended up reading in May. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought about them. Thanks for watching. I will have my TBR for June? No, that's not right. Holy shit. I will have my TBR for June up in the next few days, so keep your eyes out. Keep your eyes open. Keep your papers peeled for that. I will see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.